Paul McCartney almost died in this helicopter crash. On a stormy night in the May 20th 12, Paul McCartney and his wife boarded a helicopter for what seemed like a routine flight home. Little did they know they were inches away from a deadly disaster looming around the corner in anticipation of claiming the life of one of the most influential figures in the music industry. Disoriented by the thick fog and near zero visibility, the pilot found himself in a nightmare. The helicopter was mere inches away from towering trees. In fact, the helicopter was just a guitar's length away from a tragic fate. This is the untold story of how Paul McCartney almost died in a helicopter crash. Today, we've got a wild, untold story for you about none other than the legendary Paul McCartney.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad.
Now, we all know Paul as a musical icon. Paul McCartney started his incredible career as a member of the Beatles. As a founding member of the Beatles, he helped revolutionize pop and rock music, giving us the gift of timeless hits like Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be. After the Beatles, his success continued with the band Wings. His solo career was equally remarkable, from collaborations with other artists to music that kept him at the top of the industry for decades. But what you probably don't know is how a tragic fate was waiting for him on a night of May. Let's dive into the incident of that fateful night. The date is May 3rd, 2012. It's late at night. Paul, 70 years old at the time, is heading home to his estate in East Sussex, England, after attending the launch of Mary McCartney Cookbook. Instead of taking a car, Paul and his wife, Nancy Shevel, traveled in style in a helicopter. But the weather that night was not so great. The fog was so thick, you could barely see a thing. A perfect recipe for disaster. The helicopter was a private chartered helicopter. The intended route of the helicopter was from a private landing spot in Peasmarsh, East Sussex, McCartney's home state, to Battersea Heliport in London, and then the return flight back to Peasmarsh. You might be wondering, what kind of helicopter was Paul flying in? It was a Sikorsky S-76C, registered as GWIW, which had been in service since 2007. If we talk about the crew, it consisted of the main pilot, a 55-year-old male who had an experience of 10,250 hours of flying and 4,800 hours of this specific type. The co-pilot, who could also act as a commander, was a 42-year-old male with a total flying time of 5,185 hours on this type of aircraft. Everything was set for a smooth ride. Or so they thought. As the pre-flight preparation started, the pilot and the co-pilot both discussed the weather, flight details, and fuel needs before the flight. It was decided that the co-pilot would fly the first part of the trip and the commander would take over for the return flight. The weather was far from ideal for flying during the return flight to Peasmarsh, and the commander, who had already reviewed the weather, had already raised concern about it to the team the day before the flight. Accordingly, Lydd Airport, which was close to Peasmarsh, was chosen as a backup in case the weather at Peasmarsh made it difficult to land. There were a couple of reasons why Lydd was chosen as the backup option. Lydd Airport was selected as the alternate option possibly, as they were expecting better weather conditions there, and even if the weather wasn't favorable, the airport had better runway infrastructure and security protocols to ensure a safe landing, and it was just 9 nautical miles away from Peasmarsh. No formal briefing took place before takeoff, possibly as the crew had decided to take the same route for the return flight as they had taken to arrive to Battersea. However, the commander did give Paul and his wife a quick safety talk and told them that if the weather got too bad, they could always land at Lydd Airport instead. Now, let's talk about the flight itself. The first half of the flight from Peasmarsh to Battersea Heliport was uneventful, but things would change on the return flight. The evening was drawing in as the Sikorsky S-76C helicopter prepared to take off for the return flight to Peasmarsh. The commander was at the controls in the right seat, while the co-pilot sat to his left, ready for the journey ahead. The helicopter took off from Battersea at exactly 21:35. The pilots were navigating through what is called IMC, or Instrument Meteorological Conditions. It pretty much means that they were flying blind. There were only brief glimpses of the ground below, and the cruising altitude was 2,100 feet. When you're flying in IMC, which is airplane language for "we can't see a thing out here," You have to rely completely on your instruments to keep you safe. You cannot depend on visual cues or horizon. You just have to rely on the data in front of you. So, accordingly, to prepare for that, the commander asked his co-pilot to get the METR, Meteorological Aerodrome Report, from LID and to inform them they were on their way to Peasmarsh. So, what's the METR? Basically, it's real-time weather data that is sent from the nearest airport. It gives the crew everything they need to assess how the landing conditions might be. The co-pilot gave a verbal acknowledgement of this. Now, this is important to remember because we are going to come back to it in just a second. The pilot also said that he was setting LID Q and H on the altimeters. The Q and H is a term used in aviation to refer to the barometric pressure at sea level. When pilots set the Q and H on their altimeters, they adjust the altimeter to show their altitude above sea level rather than above the ground. This is important when you're flying in dense fog, where one wrong move could put you in the trees. In every disaster, there is never a single factor that leads to it. It's more like a systematic error, where mistakes start piling up, which finally result in a disaster. So remember how we discussed the co-pilot acknowledging the pilot's request for METR? This is where the first error took place. While the co-pilot adjusted the altimeters, he didn't bother to record the meter report, which had a significant impact on the events that were about to unfold, as they had no idea about the weather conditions near LID. Now, the minimum safe altitude for their approach was 1,250 feet. The commander, however, had different plans. The pilot planned to descend to 500 feet in order to allow himself to establish a visual approach. This means he was hoping to get below the thick fog and clouds so that he could visually locate the landing site at Peasmarsh. In poor weather conditions, pilots often descend to a lower altitude in the hope of breaking through the fog or clouds to get a clear view of the ground. However, descending to 500 feet was risky, especially in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, where visibility is severely limited, and this was the second mistake that would jeopardize the safety of the flight. The pilot was essentially relying on finding an area where the weather was better to be able to see the landing site. This approach was dangerous because the terrain and obstacles like trees could be very close, and without clear visibility, the pilot wouldn't have enough reaction time to avoid them. The commander, unsure of his actions, decided to descend to 600 feet to establish a visual approach. The co-pilot asked him if it was safe, but did not insist, as he believed his better option was to support the commander as effectively as he could, even though he believed that the commander's actions were flawed. As they descended, the co-pilot was focused on the instruments, constantly updating the commander on their distance, height, and speed. But when they got closer to the landing site, the commander realized they had a major problem. They were coming in way too low. The co-pilot was able to briefly locate the ground, but due to the poor forward visibility and the late spotting of the landing site, he knew it was too risky to land. His commander, while not discussing it, also decided to execute a go-round due to the high speed and altitude of the helicopter. Now, here's where it gets even more intense. As he made the right-hand turn, he recalled a quick conversation about their plan with his co-pilot. He believed his co-pilot was on board with this approach, and so, with confidence in his decision, he disengaged the flight director, which automates some of the flight controls, and took manual control of the helicopter. As they made the turn, the helicopter flew over the landing site at Peasmarsh at about 300 feet above ground level and at a speed of 35 knots. As the commander continued, he noticed the lights of Rye and some nearby homes. This gave the pilot a false sense of hope that visibility was getting better and the clouds were higher in that area. It was at this moment that he started a right turn to make a second attempt to land at Peasmarsh. At first, he could see the lights of the helipad clearly, but soon he started to face difficulties. In an attempt to maintain his altitude and reduce his speed, he lost sight of the helipad lights at the edge of the field that were visible before. As he continued the turn, he had to rely only on the lights in the center of the field for guidance, which increased the risks of landing. As the helicopter continued its turn, it started descending at an alarming rate, up to 500 feet per minute. The Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, EGPWS, started going off, first issuing a caution terrain warning, and soon the warning terrain alert started going off, which was much more dangerous. The tension in the cockpit started rising with the helicopter's altitude, dropping dangerously close to 100 feet above ground level. What is surprising, however, is that neither the commander nor the co-pilot registered the blaring warnings, probably because they were caught up in the stress of the moment as they descended dangerously close to the treetops below them. It was becoming more important with every passing second that they needed to make a decision. For a moment, the helicopter climbed, reaching about 400 feet above mean sea level. But this brief sense of relief was rather short-lived. They then started to descend again, and the pilot noticed that the lights in the center of the field began to flicker. Why was this happening, you may be wondering? Well, the lights would have appeared to be flickering because the commander was losing sight of them due to the helicopter's sudden and rapid descent and due to the interference caused by the treetops. As the helicopter continued falling, his line of sight of the light would be occluded intermittently, making it appear as though it was turning on and off. This kind of visual distraction can lead to confusion, especially in low visibility conditions where a clear reference is crucial for flying safely. The co-pilot was watching the instruments when he noticed the helicopter was rapidly descending. He warned the commander of this, and just then, he saw the radio altimeter count down to 0. For a few moments, he was dumbstruck because he felt they were going to crash. It came to be more and more apparent with every passing second that the helicopter was dangerously close to the treetops. The pilot made a split-second decision. It was time to initiate an aggressive go-around. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled the helicopter back up into the air, applying power to gain altitude. Being in such a stressful moment, he felt confused and started becoming disoriented, which is not a surprise considering the circumstances. As the helicopter was gaining altitude, the alarm for the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, EGPWS, started going off, indicating that the helicopter was flying too low to the ground. It was later found that the helicopter had recorded its lowest altitude a mere 2 feet above the ground. Perhaps at this moment, the gravity of their situation made the pilot hard. Landing at the intended site no longer seemed like an option. It was simply too dangerous. And with this, the commander decided to climb back into Instrument Meteorological Conditions, IMC. Even though this meant navigating through poor visibility, it seemed like a safer choice. He routed the helicopter towards Lid Airport, where they could make a safe landing. The landing there went smoothly, and the passengers got off to continue their journey by car. Once the pilots returned to Stansted, they headed to the office to do the post-flight paperwork. The commander completed the report on the Peasmarsh incident and left the document to be read by the chief pilot. In great failure, they neglected to record the go-around maneuver. They also failed to file any air safety reports regarding the incident, a decision that could have serious implications. In the days that followed after the incident, the helicopter was taken for a routine inspection. When the management of the company heard about this incident, they had the engineers again go over the helicopter. Fortunately, the inspections did not show any damage. UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch conducted the inquiry into the accident involving Sikorsky S-76C on May 3, 2012. The inquiry pointed out some major lapses in reporting and procedural adherence. The incident was not reported to the operator in time, which led to a delay in classifying it as a serious incident. As a result of this delay, flight data recorder data was retrieved, but voice recordings had been overwritten. The data from the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, EGPWS, was utilized for the investigation, as it had recorded alerts and warnings issued during the flight. This was used to conclude the reasons for this incident. The findings suggested that both pilots faced difficulty in maintaining situational awareness due to reduced visibility and the decision to execute a low-altitude orbit, which was the major reason for the helicopter's near miss. In response to the incident, the investigation also made a recommendation to the Civil Aviation Authority, CAA. The recommendation was that the CAA should reevaluate regulations allowing helicopter descents below minimum safety altitudes in IMC without published approach procedures. Paul McCartney had a terrifying brush with death. As thick fog blinded the helicopter's descent, it came within feet of crashing into trees. At the last second, the pilot managed to pull up, saving everyone on board. Can you believe how close we came to losing Paul McCartney that night? It's incredible how a few quick decisions and, well, a lot of luck kept one of the greatest musicians in history safe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.